organizer's perspective, this is a very good problem to have. Too many people would like to have chairs. Very much better than the opposite way. My name is John Satcher. I'm the chair of the UCF History Department, and I'm sure there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people who will extend a welcome to you tonight. This is our 3rd annual Gerald Shofner Lecture. Gerald Shofner was a chair of the History Department and an editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. And so 3 years ago, we started a lecture series in his honor, which is going to bring Florida history from around the United States and from around the world into our university. And so I know you all want to see the lecture and not see me. I'm going to go ahead and turn over the introductions to Connie Lester, who is the current chair of the Florida Historical Quarterly. That's been the current editor. She's been the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly since 2005. So I think now you're entering into one of the longest time spans as editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, which has grown successfully, tremendously under her leadership. In particular, I think the web presence has increased tremendously, and I think she's done a great job. And this lecture is partially one of the things she's brought to the Florida Historical Quarterly. So, Connie, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, with an introduction like that, I can just go home now. I don't have to do anything else. Okay. So, as Dr. Satcher said, I'm the editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly, and I want to welcome you to the 3rd annual Gerald Shofner Lecture on Florida history. Let me say just a few words about the lecture and its origins. The lecture series is an outreach of the Florida Historical Quarterly, which is the peer-reviewed scholarly publication of the Florida Historical Society. The offices of the Quarterly are in the History Department here at UCF, and the Society headquarters are in Cocoa. The Florida Historical Quarterly is in its 94th year of publication and came to UCF from the University of Florida in the mid-90s. Dr. Shofner was the first editor at UCF, and the lecture series was named to honor his contributions to Florida history, his work as an editor, his scholarship, and his service as past president of the Society. Dr. Shofner attended the inaugural lecture, but unfortunately his health does not permit him to be here tonight. Nevertheless, I think we should give him a round of applause for his editorship, his scholarship, and his service to UCF. The lecture series was conceived with another project that came from the Quarterly to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the landing of Ponce de Leon in Florida in 1513. Beginning in 2013 and for each year afterward through 2017, special issues of the Quarterly will assess a single century of Florida history. Dr. Paul Hoffman of Louisiana State University was the guest editor for the first issue covering the 16th century. He was also the inaugural speaker for the first Shofner lecture. Dr. Jane Landers was the guest edited the 17th century issue, which was published in the winter of 2014, and she spoke to an enthusiastic audience last year. The 2015 special issue covered the 18th century, and Dr. Sherry Johnson, the guest editor, is our speaker tonight. And I have to say, every year this has gotten bigger and bigger in terms of the number of people who come. So by the time we get 5 years down the road, we'll have to have a new auditorium to hold us all, I think. Before we hear from Dr. Daniel Murphy, who will introduce Dr. Johnson, I want to recognize some people in tonight's audience. If you would briefly stand when your name is called, and let's hold the applause until everybody has been recognized. Dr. Mike Denham, who is the director of the Florida Studies Center at Florida Southern College in Lakeland, is here tonight. He came last year too, and we're always happy to see him. Dr. Jose Fernandez, who's Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, is here tonight. He's also a past president of the Florida Historical Society. I want to also thank several people who made this event possible. Tiffany Rivera, whose marketing and coordinating skills made sure the beautiful posters and flyers were completed, invitations were mailed, and posters placed around campus. She also arranged the food for the reception and generally kept all of us on track. Syra Ambrosekia, who is Administrative Services Coordinator in the department, pushes all the paperwork through and makes our lives so much easier. Tiffany Kilpatrick, who checked all the details and helped us set up the event. Tyler Campbell, a first-year graduate student and general go-to person. This is Tyler's third year on the Shofner lecture. 2 years ago, he was an FHQ intern. Graciela Gomez, who is our current Florida Historical Quarterly intern, worked on the brown bag lunch flyers and helped coordinate tonight's event. And we've just had a large number of people who've helped. Phi Alpha Theta and Dr. Amelia Lyons for working with the FHQ to host the brown bag lunch. Finally, I want to say something about the rest of you who are here. We have for the first time a group from Dr. Phillips High School who have come to join us. We don't usually get high school students here, and we're very happy to have them as well. I'm just happy to have all of you showing up, even if you only came because you're getting extra credit. Thank you very much.
My name is Dan Murphy. I'm assistant editor of the Florida Historical Quarterly. And I'll just echo what Connie said. We're very, very happy that everyone's here. And she thanked everybody, but I also like to thank my colleagues who are here. I really appreciate that. It shows the strength of our department, which is outstanding. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Sherry Johnson for a lot of reasons. Please bear with me while I go through some of her achievements because they're quite impressive. And we'll give you an idea why she is the 2015 Shofner Lecturer. The first thing I can say is few scholars have successfully integrated Florida's past into Atlantic, Caribbean, and environmental histories better than Sherry Johnson. She is one of these few historians who ably transcends categories. And she does it well, she's done it for a long time, and what you'll hear tonight is the result of that. Sherry was a 3-time graduate of the University of Florida. Like I said, she's transcended history field categorizations for a long time. Even before she finished her PhD, she was publishing scholarship. In fact, before she finished her PhD, she had published 2 articles with the Florida Historical Quarterly. Since then, she has penned numerous scholarly pieces on wide-ranging topics such as land use in colonial Havana, the Cuban slave trade, the late 18th century Florida to Cuban diaspora, and El Niño's impact in the colonial Caribbean. Her works have appeared in prominent journals such as the Colonial Latin American Historical Review, the Hispanic American Historical Review, and the William and Mary Quarterly. Along with these publications, she has produced dozens of book chapters, conference presentations, and databases on various topics such as the Cuban earthquake of 1880, marriage and Second Spanish period St. Augustine, and what I find to be a quite intriguing title, The Caribbean Chernobyl, which I hope we hear something about at some point. These research efforts have been magnified in Sherry's book projects as well. Reviewers lauded her first monograph, The Social Transformation of 18th Century Cuba, which was published in 2001, quote, as an important work that deserves to be read widely and a very valuable addition to Cuban historiography. Sherry's second monograph, Climate and Catastrophe in Cuba and the Atlantic World in the Age of Revolution, published in 2011, not only ably integrated environmental considerations into traditional understandings of 18th century warfare and politics in the Americas, but also won the Gordon Kaye and Sybil Lewis Prize for the best book on Caribbean studies awarded by the Caribbean Studies Association. In 2013, Sherry co-edited an essay collection with Jim Kuzik titled The Voyages of Ponce de Leon, Scholarly Perspectives 1513 to 2013, that re-examines one of the first European visitors to Florida and the consequences of his visits. In her spare time, which I don't think exists, but in her spare time, Sherry has contributed mightily to the profession and her home institution. She is currently Director of Academic Programs for the Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University, and in the past served as Graduate Program Director for the History Department at FIU. Sherry is also an appointed member of the Florida Historical Society's Board of Directors and a research associate for the historic St. Augustine Research Institute at Flagler College. In the past, she has also served as book review editor for the Hispanic American Historical Review and president of the Latin American and Caribbean section of the Southern Historical Association. Her research has been funded by the U.S. Department of Education, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Andrew P. Mellon Foundation, and the Rachel Carson Center for Environmental Studies, among others. Earlier this year, readers of the Florida Historical Quarterly got a taste of Sherry's current scholarship and impact on the profession. Continuing the journal's 500 Years of Florida History series, Sherry served as guest editor for the special issue titled The 18th Century. As with past contributions to this series, this issue combined the research findings of both established and emerging scholars and significantly advanced and updated our understanding of Florida during the 1700s. If you have not read this issue, I encourage you to check it out via JSTOR or become a member of the Florida Historical Society, which would enable you to obtain your own personal copy. I first met Sherry almost a decade ago, and every year since then, she has continued to impress me with her scholarly expertise and dedication to educating the world. Higher education needs more researchers and teachers like Sherry, individuals who selflessly contribute to their institutions and profession, regardless of the rewards or lack of them. Floridians are especially fortunate to have learned so much about their state's early past and relationship to the rest of the world as a result of her efforts. Our lives have been and will continue to be enriched by her teaching and research excellence. For those reasons, please join me in welcoming the 2015 Gerald Shofner Lecturer, Professor Sherry Johnson.
Wow. Thank you, Dan. Let me just say that nobody is more honored to be here than I am. It is really, really an honor. Not just to be here, and this crowd is amazing, but I want to tell you how I first learned of Joe Shofner. I learned of Joe Shofner and his work around 30 years ago. When I was a graduate student at the University of Florida, I was the editorial assistant on the Florida Historical Quarterly. And Dr. Samuel Proctor was the editor at the time, and he was a little bit scary, and so I figured I better read something on Reconstruction, so I asked him to suggest a book. What's the best book on Florida and Reconstruction? And he took me in his office, and he took down Joe Shofner's Nor Is It Over Yet, and he said, here, read this. So of course, I did. I went home. I ultimately graduated. Fast forward about 27 years, maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, a student came to me, a very nice young woman working on Reconstruction, taking my Florida history class, and she said, Dr. Johnson, can you recommend a book on Florida history on Reconstruction? So I took her into my office, and I took down Gerald Shofner's Nor Is It Over Yet from the shelf, and I said, here, Tiffany, read this. It remains the most important book on Reconstruction and Florida history. And so that is the greatest testament that you can give a scholar, is that their book has stood the test of time. And we can say that about Dr. Shofner's work because it has. He's written other books. He's written a great little book on a man on the Panhandle in Newport called Daniel Ladd that's immensely readable. But nothing, this book was published in 1974, Nor Is It Over Yet, nothing has surpassed the quality of scholarship. So when I say it's an honor, it really is an honor to be giving this lecture in his honor, and I'm sorry he's not here tonight. So let me continue. You'll have to bear with me. This is not going to be a read lecture. What I'm going to do tonight is a PowerPoint, and I will explain the PowerPoint slides. If you've been looking at the introductory PowerPoint, you'll understand that the images that I will present don't lend themselves to description. You have to see them to understand what's going on. So let me just get this going here. And again, let me thank the Florida Historical Quarterly and UCF for inviting me here. The title of my presentation is When Good Climates Go Bad, Climate Change, Pivot Points, and the Opportunity, Thank you. Climate Change, Pivot Points, and the Opportunities for Florida History. And what I will do tonight is I will present excerpts from two of my works that have particular relevance to Florida. The goals of this talk. I have certain specific goals that I would like to reach. First of all, I would like to introduce you to climate in history. My talk is not about the history of climate, and it's not about historical climatology. It is intended to show you how we can take what we know about climate, a science that has grown enormously in the past 20 years, and use that as methodological tools to get to new questions and new answers about history in general. I will give you examples of the two primary variables that we're looking at, temperature change and moisture change, also known as drought. I will show where these two variables come together, and for the purposes of this lecture, I've chosen to intersect them in the El Nino and La Nina. Why did I do that? Well, first of all, I don't think there's anyone in this room who's not heard of the El Nino and La Nina. Number two, we're in an El Nino year now. It is in the current news reports, and it's in the current vocabulary daily. And so hopefully you'll get something to take home and think about the El Nino phenomenon as you hear the talking heads on the radio, and also a website where you can go and get the real story. Fourthly, I'm going to present two case studies of my work on the intersection of climate and history. One is a study which I finished with Dr. Murphy mentioned on the Caribbean in general, and the other is a project that I have just begun. It is a work in progress. It's advancing as my research advances, but the important part of it is directly relevant to Florida history and to Florida and Georgia borderlands history. And finally, at the end, I will pose a couple of methodological questions on pitfalls we need to avoid in trying to put these two things together. Okay. The work I'm going to present tonight has several hypotheses. First of all, climate change and temperature change are real. There are people who don't believe climate change or temperature change are real, and I think they're incorrect. Climate change and temperature change have consequences. These are evident in cycles that we can identify, and I have arbitrarily put the name on them pivot points or pivot periods. A pivot period is when the Earth moves out of one longer cycle into the other. If you were watching the introduction PowerPoint, I highlighted some of those longer periods and times of change at the end. Point 3, climate change and a pivot point can be demonstrable, both in scientific sources and in historical sources. Scholars can use this demonstrable evidence to contribute to new interpretations. And in doing so, we can possibly provide answers not only to questions in the past about why things happen, but also in recent years, about the last 3 years, politicians and policymakers have been using people's works to ask questions about the present using data and studies from the past. Okay, basic premises of a work like this. Nothing affects daily life more than the environment, but this is especially true in pre-industrial societies, and true of societies that did not have the benefit of air conditioning. Point 2, climate and weather-induced stress were major players in the quality of life in Florida and on the southeastern borderlands. For the purposes of historical research, the difference between climate and weather: climate is a long-term phenomenon. Weather is an event or a series of events with a short-term duration that contribute to this long-term characteristics of climate. When we talk about climate change, we are really talking about changes in people's everyday lives. We analyze what a given society is used to and gauge how the difference between what they're used to differs from what happens in the future. In my opinion, there's no such thing as good climate or bad climate. One person's good climate is another person's bad climate. I grew up in Miami in the 1950s. We had no air conditioning. I can't imagine living without air conditioning. Miami in the 1950s was somebody's bad climate, trust me. And so all of these terms are relative. They depend upon the society you're looking at and what people are accustomed to. Climate versus extreme events means that deviations from the norm don't necessarily signal climate change. Instead, they have been given the term an extreme event or an extreme weather event. These can be a series of events. They can provoke triggers for change. However, if you get enough of these extreme events all together, taken as a whole, taken over a period of time, maybe 100 years, maybe longer, they can be indicators that the climate is indeed changing. And the two extreme events that are the easiest to recapture and the most visible are temperature fluctuations and moisture fluctuations. Moisture is the presence or the absence in the atmosphere. We mostly know it as drought. Okay, I've been showing you this image throughout the introductory presentation. Let me tell you what it is. This is one of a series of graphs of climate change, temperature change specifically. It comes from the National Climate Data Center. The National Climate Data Center is a NOAA agency that collects studies such as this. The URL is there. If you like, I'm also provided to anybody who wants to ruin their lives and certainly the rest of their weekend because you'll be so fascinated. What this is a series of studies of temperature change worldwide. This graph I've chosen goes back to 800 because in the introductory presentation, I chose the Maya as an example. If you go on this URL, they have graphs like this that go back 10,000s of years. And as you can see, temperature fluctuates up and down. We'll be able to identify distinct periods. Each of these lines represents a single study. These studies are identified up here. They're the gradations. These are deviations from a 0 point, less than half a degree and a full degree. This 0 point line is the average daily temperature from roughly 1958 to roughly 1980. This was established by scientists who began to work on climate change in the 1950s and 1960s as a baseline to be able to determine how far away the climate was in the past from what people were used to. And as you can see, it was quite different. This, by the way, is a northern hemisphere reconstruction, but if you get the southern hemisphere reconstructions, they are virtually identical. Okay, I introduced this also in the rolling presentation at the beginning. I have isolated a time called the medieval warm period. The medieval warm period ran from roughly 900 to about 1000. This was a time in which the temperature was much warmer to the north. It led to the expansion of the Norse civilization, known more colloquially as Vikings. Greenland was so pleasant, it was then somebody's good climate. And the Vikings were able to expand across the ocean and settle the Americas. Around 1300, the temperature began to get markedly colder. And by around 1450, the Earth entered into a different phase that lasted nearly 400 years that has been called the Little Ice Age. This particular phase made Greenland uninhabitable, but it allowed for the expansion of Iberia. Up until about 6 years ago, nobody could hypothesize why this was true. And for those who do Hispanic American civilization, I'd also like to point out that this happens to be the time in which the Europeans expanded out from Europe. Let me tell you the most recent hypothesis why this is so, and it comes from the reputable scholar who was the head of the International Panel for Climate Change. He hypothesized that during the medieval warm period, the temperature was so warm that there were many, many more hurricanes than there are even now. And so with more hurricanes occurring, it would have made cross-Atlantic passages, this is my hypothesis, cross-Atlantic passages impossible, and therefore it made the Norse were expanding in Greenland. With the waning of the medieval warm period into the Little Ice Age, the prevalence of hurricanes in the Caribbean would go down, and I'll back this up with some other graphs later, making therefore possible for European expansion across the ocean. My thesis that goes along with this is that human activity is related to these cycles. We can tell from settlement patterns, we can tell from imperial expansion where the empires will go when they have the opportunity to do so. Factor number 2, drought. What you're looking at is something called the North American Drought Atlas. If you go on this website and you choose any of these points, you can click on the points and it will give you a running graph of the drought conditions over a period of years. So if you were to go to this and click on, you would get something that looks like this. This particular image comes from Jacksonville. And what this shows is a deviation from the norm of moisture in the atmosphere. Over here, this is something called the Palmer Drought Severity Index that tells you how wet or how dry a climate happens to be at a particular time. This over here on the right is the number of chronologies. That means the number of samples that they took to be able to make these calculations. And as you can see, as you get closer to the present day, the number goes up, meaning that there's greater confidence in the results. So where do these two come together? They come together in the El Nino and the La Nina. This is an example of what is El Nino. El Nino is a warming of the Pacific waters along the equator off the coast of Ecuador. This image is current. This came from the NOAA website. It was current as of, this is an August image that comes up in September, and these are the conditions we are experiencing today. These are the consequences for the El Nino in the Caribbean. Again, this is current information that came up in February, and as you can see in the Caribbean basin, if you're in an El Nino, you can experience dry and warm conditions. There has been a debate over whether El Nino contributes to the existence of hurricanes, and along with the slide that was up there, this information came up from NOAA, and I've highlighted the important phrase. In years with moderate to strong El Nino, the North Atlantic Basin, that's us, experiences a substantial reduction in cyclone, that's hurricane numbers, a 60% reduction in numbers of hurricane days, and an overall reduction in system intensity. And so NOAA pretty much has made its statement on what it feels about the El Nino phenomenon in the Caribbean. The opposite of the El Nino is La Nina. La Nina is a returning away from the warm conditions on the equator. There is a cycle in the middle called a neutral cycle, but the La Nina is more relevant to Florida because we experience, La Nina produces a dry and cool cycle, dry meaning the temperature goes from 95 down to 90, but wet and cool goes from 95 to 90, but experiences more storms and more hurricanes, which of course affects us in Florida. And so I've highlighted these phrases also. Cycle during hurricane season, the Caribbean can expect to experience a small increase in the number of hurricanes and a small increase in their intensity. And finally, in the bottom, the scientists have finally come to the conclusion that the number of hurricanes fluctuates over time. And this is the important take-home message, I think, is that if we have more hurricanes at a certain period of time, we can expect that human activity will be affected.